Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for a conversation with Annie Lowrey from The Atlantic. I'm Catherine Bracy. I'm the founder and executive director of the TechEquity Collaborative. We're going to wait a few minutes to let the room fill up and then we will get started. Hello for all of you who've just joined us. I'm Catherine Bracy. I'm the founder and executive director of the TechEquity Collaborative. Thank you for joining us for this conversation with Annie Lowrey. We are going to wait just a couple of minutes to get started so the room can fill up. So just sit tight. Hey to everyone who's just joined us, welcome. I'm Catherine Bracy. I'm the founder and executive director of the TechEquity Collaborative. Thanks for joining us for this conversation with Annie Lowrey. We are just waiting for folks to file in, so we'll get started in just a minute or so. Okay, we are going to go ahead and get started. Again, I'm Catherine Bracy, founder and executive director of the TechEquity Collaborative. Thank you for joining us for this conversation with Annie Lowrey, a staff writer at The Atlantic. She has written a lot on the economic crisis, both pre and I guess post, during, whatever we're in the middle of, present pandemic moment. And we're going to dig into that in just a minute. But before we start, I just want to let those of you who are new to TechEquity know what we do. So we are mobilizing tech workers and tech companies on issues that we think will make it so that as the tech economy grows, more people benefit from that growth. And we do three things. We educate tech workers and companies about the issues that we're working on. We participate in advocacy campaigns to get public policy passed that will help move our agenda forward. And we connect tech workers and companies to the communities where they live. We focus on two issues primarily: housing and workforce and labor, which obviously are very connected to the conversation we're going to be having with Annie. If you work in tech and want to get involved with us, please visit TechEquityCollaborative.org to sign up for our newsletter, or become a member. It's $10 a month or $100 a year, and your support, your membership helps us push our agenda and make it so that as tech grows, more people benefit from that growth. So let's get into this conversation with Annie Lowrey from The Atlantic. Annie, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you've written a lot about the economic crisis, really of the last 10 years, which I don't know that, everyone might have called the economy we've been living in for the last 10 years a crisis. But we pulled out this one article, The Great Affordability Crisis, that you wrote, what, in February or?
Yeah, it was this winter sometime.
Yeah, so just before the pandemic, and it was pretty prescient. So we zeroed in on that article, sort of the basis for this conversation, but I'm hoping we can have a wide-ranging discussion about a lot of the issues that you work on. As we start, I'm wondering if you can just paint us a picture of what the pre-pandemic economic life of a typical American family was like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, nationally it was interesting because it was a real kind of best of times, worst of times scenario where the economy was really good in the sense that growth was fine. It wasn't spectacular. Productivity growth wasn't great, but it was okay, and had been on a kind of long-term secular decline for quite some time. But the unemployment rate was really low. And incomes were rising, including, and really importantly, incomes at the bottom of the wage spectrum. And that was both due to the fact that the economy was just kind of hot enough to force companies to pay workers more. There was more competition for workers, and due to a huge number of minimum wage increases that came into effect, mostly through the Obama years and also the Trump years. And so the strange thing about this was that it didn't feel great to a lot of families. There was still a lot of economic pessimism out there. And I think that the big thing that was happening was that even though wages were increasing and unemployment was good, in the sense that it was low, the cost of living had become a crisis for people, not just in places like San Francisco and Oakland and San Jose, where it has absolutely been a crisis for quite some time now, but really around the country. And there's a bunch of kind of buckets that you can look at and think about, where the cost of just basic things that you really need to live had increased faster than wage growth or just the overall rate of inflation. And so there's a lot of those, but the really big ones are healthcare costs, including out-of-pocket healthcare costs, which is really important for family thriving. Education, in particular, higher ed, so the cost of college and student loan debt. Housing, which is a really big issue, obviously, in the entire state of California, but actually also even rural communities, smaller cities and metro areas also, and then healthcare. So childcare, excuse me. And so that meant that pretty high up the income spectrum, so absolute crisis at the bottom, but fairly high up the income spectrum, if you were living in a big metro area, a really great economy didn't feel that good. And I think that you can actually see that if you look at a lot of families who live in, Berkeley or San Francisco or on the peninsula or in Marin, where couples will be making, or individuals will be making, six-figure salaries and will still feel like they're kind of just getting by. And not that we obviously want to be much more worried about people at the bottom of the wage spectrum, but it was an interesting reality that you could be making $100,000 a year and still not being able to save any money at the end of the month. And $100,000 a year is twice what the average American makes.
Yeah, I mean, I think the technical definition of low income in San Francisco right now is something like $120,000 a year,
Yeah.
which is wild. I kind of see that paradox where on paper, all the economic indicators that we've been told to look at to know if the economy is doing well were good, but in reality, people were not feeling that, that kind of confidence in their own personal financial or economic life. And that feels like, that's being exposed now, the weaknesses of the real economy. We're going to talk about that in a second, but I'd also, before we get into how we got here, why is it that on paper the economy looks really good, but people don't feel like they're doing very well? I know that the crisis has felt even worse for families of color in communities of color. So I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit about how the affordability crisis is even more acute for Black and Brown communities.
Yeah, so I think Black and Brown communities are facing an exaggerated version of what the country as a whole is facing. And that's exaggerated through the propulsive force of racism. So first, the Black unemployment rate is roughly double the white unemployment rate, regardless of how good the economy is. So you're facing a structurally more challenging job market. Second, because Black workers are more likely to be lower wage workers, they didn't have the same wage growth in some cases that white workers had. So that's one issue. Third is that we know that there is a force of structural racism in the housing market that leads Black families to pay more for housing than similarly situated white families. And so you can see that in terms of rentals and also in terms of things like mortgages. So if you take families on paper that look quite similar, almost identical, white families and Black families pay higher mortgage rates. There's still all sorts of, in some cases, quite overt redlining that happens. And so then on top of that, I think that the pandemic has exposed that there are health crises in the Black community that haven't been addressed because we have this system of health insurance that is still tied to employment, that still leaves millions of people uncovered. We don't have a great public system, especially in some states. So California's Medicaid program is actually pretty expensive in comparison to a Texas, for instance. But nevertheless, we still have huge disparities in health outcomes, which is a crisis in and of itself, and also feeds into workplace and employment and childcare and education and all of these other issues. So there's just a lot of mutually reinforcing effects that have made all of this tougher for Black and Brown families. And I think it's really important to note that it's not just about wages and income, right? It's about the interplay between all of these things. And that meant that Black and Brown families were more fragile coming into this health crisis, that now they're also having worse health outcomes. And in some cases, their work has become more dangerous because, in particular, Black women and Latinx women are more likely to be essential workers, frontline workers. And so, again, it's this really difficult, thorny, self-reinforcing thing that's happening, and it's a crisis. Gosh, I feel like you could talk for a very long time about the way in which this is bad and is amplifying the forces, the racial disparities that we already had.
Yeah, I feel like we're going to say the word crisis a lot in this conversation. I also forgot to mention at the top that we are going to be taking questions from the audience. So if you have questions for Annie, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Please put your questions there. Marion, our communications director, is in there curating your questions, and they'll be popping them out to us with about 15 or 20 minutes to go. If you want to just chat, you can use the chat function, but if you're asking a question for Annie or me, put that in the Q&A function. So let's talk about how we got here. Why is it that the economy can be booming and people are feeling more and more squeezed?
I think that this is a public policy issue primarily. So I don't think that this is primarily an issue about sort of individual choices that families are making. So when you compare the US to other OECD countries, we look really similar in terms of certain pieces of our social infrastructure. And maybe we even do a little bit better than some other countries in certain pieces of our social infrastructure. So one of these is retirement benefits. We like roughly have the same retirement benefit coverage that other countries do. Social Security is a really powerful force for housing security, for health security, and for income security for older folks. But in a lot of other ways, the United States, and actually to relate to the prior question, this is largely, though not exclusively, due to anti-Black racism, is missing kind of critical pieces of its social infrastructure. So healthcare, right? Why don't we have universal healthcare like all of our peer countries? And why is our healthcare, even if it's not universal, twice as expensive? We have this kind of hybridized public-private model. It's still tied to employment. We pay a lot of money for kind of worse health outcomes. And though the government is obviously very involved in the provision of insurance and healthcare in this country, it doesn't play the same role as it does in like a Switzerland or a UK or a Singapore in terms of setting prices, ensuring access to care. And this is after the Affordable Care Act, notably, which made really big steps towards getting us to universal care and making it affordable. So childcare. The US is really, really unusual in leaving parents on their own until their kid is 5 for the most part. So DC, where I used to live, has universal pre-K 3 and 4, but most places don't, right? And we just don't have that as a public good. So I think that's part of it. In housing policy, the answer is a little bit more complicated, but nevertheless, I would note that other countries have done more to protect renters, to keep housing prices low, to have more social housing, whether that's public housing or public-private models that are providing housing. And in the US, I think that the fact that housing policy is determined at a very, very local level has contributed to this problem of undersupply and rising prices. So, you know, these are really, really complicated issues with sort of decades of history. And, you know, we could talk a lot about like the interplay between the federal governments and the state and local governments. But really, I think what is at work here is that there are market failures, is one way to put it, and the government doesn't step in to correct them. So, you know, like German college grads do not have $30,000 in debt. You know, Spanish citizens do not have to.
Would be great. That's like,
like Spanish citizens don't have to worry that like if they lose their job, they're going to lose their health care. In France, if you have a kid, you go to a public creche system and they literally just send you cash to make sure that you have enough money for childcare. We just don't do that. And you know, again, the reasons are complicated there, but this is you know, like this is what we have elected as a country to have, is to have sort of a skimpier set of safety net benefits, but also just less social infrastructure in general. And I think that this is a product of that, though certainly it's not the only thing happening.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that feels like part of the answer, but that's been true for you know, decades, and it feels like these last 10 years have been unique. And I'm wondering if that's an effect of, you know, chickens coming home to roost. Like we've gone so long, decades and decades, without investing in the safety net, that now it's just, you know, not, the cracks are now really apparent. Or was there something about the recovery from the 2008 recession that was different than recoveries in the past?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, look, like I think one of the things that has changed in the past few decades that we haven't talked about as much is that there's an inequality thing happening here too, right? Where we've had dramatic increases in wage and wealth inequality. And that has meant, I think, that the economic worlds of high income and low income Americans have diverged. And cities have become really unequal places, right? And I think that this is kind of part of it. Living in many major American cities, in some cases, feels like a luxury good, which it kind of didn't used to. So I think that that's really part of it. So if you look at why inequality has increased since the 1970s, then you get into kind of really complicated, interesting stuff about the decline of unionization, about increasing corporate concentration, and a bunch of other factors that are really complicated. But yeah, affordability is about both sides of the ledger, right? So like your income and how that income is dispersed among the population matters, and then what you're paying for with that income matters too. So I think that there's just a bunch of really strong tidal forces. And in terms of the, what happened to the economy after 2008, and the last recession, was that I think you saw kind of an exaggeration of this, where the rich rebounded really strongly. And by the time that this recession happened, the poor families were just sort of starting to kind of catch up. They were just had a couple years of the kind of wage growth that you would like to see. And then the pandemic hit, and we have the worst jobs crisis in 80 years. It's worse than it was in 2008 somehow. And I think, unfortunately, this recession is going to be with us for quite a long time. Oh, you're on mute, Catherine.
Sorry about that. I have kids playing out, not my kids, but some kids playing outside. So I'm muting when you're talking. But, that's where I was going to go with this is now, we were just maybe starting to get to a point where lower and middle income families could gain a foothold in the economy, and then the pandemic hit. And I do have a concern. I mean, we work with tech workers, obviously, and for us, it was very easy to kind of transition to working, relatively easy to transition to working from home. There weren't like wide scale job losses in the tech industry. And it feels like, and in some cases, tech companies are doing very well in this moment. My concern is we're going to ride this out just fine. And then when the recovery starts, we'll be in a much better position than we were before, and inequality will just skyrocket because families who are devastated in this economy are not going to be able to gain a foothold in that recovery because they were already on the back foot coming out of, the last recession. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think that we can kind of already see this happening. I was looking at some reports about the housing market in the Bay Area, and apparently because interest rates are so low, there's just been a flood of more cash purchases of homes, and prices haven't in some places declined at all, which is crazy to think about when you think about an economy in which 40 million people have lost their job and there's 15% unemployment. So the inequalities of this recession are really, really stark. So, low wage workers, job loss has been concentrated among low wage workers. So that's a really big problem to begin with. And businesses that were white collar, that were tech based, had less sort of person-to-person necessary interaction to begin with, have really transitioned in some cases quite well, right? And then on top of that, I think we saw this in the last recession too. There's this funny way in which, because corporations are so cash rich and interest rates remain so low, when you have these recessions, you can sometimes see this kind of increase in corporate concentration, which I imagine that we'll see in the next year or two, where companies that have survived this just fine actually just kind of eat up their little competitors, and the market looks even a little bit better for them. They often take recessions as opportunities to lay workers off and tighten themselves up a little bit. And I don't want to like overplay that side of things at all. Like, recessions are bad for businesses. They are bad for productivity. They are bad for capital investment. They are bad for all of these things. And I really worry that this recession, combined with the policies, especially the immigration policies that we're seeing from the administration, are going to hurt America's long-term competitiveness pretty badly. I'm really worried, for instance, about how hard we're making it for foreign students to come here and stay here. And so I think that that's, kind of an issue too. I think that this is going to make the problems that the Bay Area and tech was experiencing in terms of equity, I don't see how it doesn't make it worse, though who knows how this all plays out. Because I feel like we're getting to this point where, we're going to understand just how bad and how intractable this recession is going to be in the next couple months, now that the lockdowns, for better or worse, are lifting, and obviously for health reasons, for worse. It's very scary that we're 4 months in and the health crisis is worse than it was in March.
Do you have predictions for how you see us emerging from, like, what's the trajectory here for the economic crisis? Because we're kind of in this pattern now of, well, I don't know if it's a pattern yet, but it's like a open, close, and there are these little spikes of, the unemployment rate, or the new unemployment claims number goes down, and then now it's back up again. Like, how are you seeing that? And when do you see us, I mean, I guess it kind of depends on what the public health outcomes are, but, in the 3 to 5 years, like, what does the pathway look like, do you think?
Yeah. I hope that I am wrong about this, but I'm terrified. So we know that if you don't get the virus under control, people don't go out and act like consumers like normal. So it doesn't matter if you reopen. There was a good paper by Austin Goolsbee, who used to be in the Obama administration, and he's at UChicago now. And he does some interesting tech economics too, but that basically showed that people's behavior changed prior to shelter in place orders, and that people seem to be really sensitive to local death rates from the coronavirus in terms of their behavior as opposed to public ordinances. And so I think one of the great mistakes that the Trump administration made was in presuming that, like, if you kind of open the economy back up, people will come back, and they won't. And I think that's because, large shares of Americans have a person over the age of 65 in their house. Large shares of Americans are immunosuppressed, right? Like, this virus is really frightening, and people are just unwilling in some cases to risk their lives. And I think are also kind of seeing the economic issues out there and have sort of taken it on themselves to do what public policy isn't doing, which is to try to control the viral spread. And so, Republicans are already signaling that they have less and less appetite for stimulus. The stimulus that the government has already spent didn't even act like stimulus. All it was doing was kind of shoring families up. It wasn't like actually revving the engine of the economy. And I don't think that we're getting the virus under control. And so I'm just really worried. I don't know what that means. Other countries are kind of reopening and rebounding. The US economy was doing really, had major issues, but it was really doing well a couple months ago. But I just worry that we're looking at mass business failures, a long period of underinvestment in things like R&D, insufficient government stimulus to get us out of the recession. So I don't think that there's anything to suggest that this is going to go better than 2008 did. And I really think that the catastrophe period, the period where the economy was just terrible, back in 2008, was almost 5 years long. And then you didn't see a low wage recovery for a couple years past that. And this is already worse, right? Like, the hit is already bigger. And, it was very troubling this week to see Republicans say that, they're withdrawing the $600 a week UI bump, and that they didn't want the new stimulus bill to be bigger than $1 trillion. Because, like, you're trying to fill like a $5 trillion hole with $1 trillion in stimulus, and it's not going to work. So it's bad. It's so bad. And I really hope I'm wrong. I really do. I would love to be wrong.
Let's attempt to move to a place of hope. I mean, for me, if there's a silver lining in all of this, it's that, things have gotten so bad that maybe there's political will now for big, bold solutions that there maybe wouldn't have been before.
Yes.
So let's talk about some of those big, bold solutions. What do you think we need in order to get us to a place where low and middle income families have economic resiliency and can benefit from boom cycles?
Yeah. the place where I'm really hopeful is that these are problems, public policy problems that the US can solve itself, right? These are not like really mysterious, difficult, we don't know what the answers are. It's not got to do with like global growth and trade patterns that we don't control. Like we have the toolbox. It's entirely a matter of, or mostly a matter of political will. So, it's pretty remarkable how fast and how far the Democratic Party has moved to the left on universal health care. And I think that they see that as a great not completed project from the Obama administration. So Joe Biden, one of his three top planks of his economic plan is a pretty comprehensive 0 to 5 childcare program where we would actually get universal pre-K for 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, which would mean, if you are a parent in the Bay Area, you don't have to figure that out for yourself. And I think that that's also, a pretty big mental thing. Housing policy is a little bit more challenging because it has to happen. A lot of it has to happen at the local level in terms of policies to allow more building where that's the answer, and to protect renters and low-income homeowners where that's the answer. But one thing that I do think would be good at the federal level is to make housing vouchers or another solution for lower income families or renters, make them an entitlement, because right now, if you qualify for the home mortgage interest deduction, you just get it, right? Like you just say on your taxes, this is how much I, want on my mortgage. But if you want access to public housing vouchers, it's like not an entitlement at all, right? Like there's a budget and most people don't get it. Very, very small proportions actually do. So something like that could be really good. And then, the degree to which student loan debt could be unilaterally forgiven by the government, there's amenable to a lot of solutions there. And so the politics of this, how expensive, quote unquote, it would be, I don't want to say the challenge is political and getting people to the point that they can actually vote on this. And I think that the problem is not Democrats, the problem is Republicans, who have become they've become a party driven by identity politics, driven by racial resentment, a party that has become answerable to a smaller number of people, that they become more focused on, I think, cultural grievance. So if you go back to the Bush years, where they really were more focused on sort of corporatism, where there was kind of compassionate conservatism, and they were just a lot more willing to compromise, but because of negative partisanship and polarization and a lot of these strong forces, I think that they've gotten kind of backed into a corner intellectually in some ways. And that's not to say that there aren't lots of great Republican and conservative ideas out there, but it's become hard for them to push them forward for a lot of reasons. And the Trump administration is just not a policy forward administration at all. And
That's
so
a very nice way to put it.
Yeah. And so one thing that, I don't totally, Mike Lee and Marco Rubio, who are not they're quite conservative, very, very conservative. They had a really good proposal to expand the child tax credit. And that didn't even make it into the Trump tax bill. And I've always kind of wondered, right? The ideas are out there. And I think it's kind of a structural political thing that it's just hard for Republicans to get there, even on issues that they really care about. So Republicans really care about pronatal policy and making it easy and viable for people to have kids. But that doesn't really, you wouldn't know that looking at their policy platform, which is itself quite thin at the moment.
I actually want to come back to this issue because I do think it's an interesting one, but staying on the solutions for a minute, I do think, the childcare thing, I don't have kids, so this is never something that I had to deal with personally, but it feels like now it has moved from kind of the background as sort of a personal economic issue to the foreground as a public policy issue. And not just this is stressful that my kids are at home, but it could be a real drag, not just on, education, but you can't work. Adults cannot be productive if they have to be full-time parents and full-time employees at the same time. So can you just say a little bit more about the idea of universal childcare and what Joe Biden is proposing to do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I really like this idea that childcare is infrastructure, right? It is like roads and bridges. It is like a thing that you are putting in place to help other economic activity happen. And I think that is agnostic as to the personal choice of a parent, whether they want to work or not. But if we want to keep parents in the workforce, and this is obviously an issue where gender comes into play because it's more often women who drop out of the workforce to take care of kids, though that's not universally true. If you want women in the workforce, if you want them to see the same wage gains as their male colleagues, then you want to make it such that they are not facing, and again, to point out that this happens for all genders, that they're not facing this chasm, right? That they don't have to figure it out on their own, that they don't have to face this economic issue of, oh, okay, well, given how costly this is, does it make more sense for one of us not to work for some period of time? And so I feel like if we think of this as sort of a piece of infrastructure, I'd also note that it makes no sense to me that you would say that K through 12 is a public good, and people obviously have the optionality of private education, but you know, what's magic about turning 5, right? Like, in so many ways it's more important for that 0 to 5 period, where we know that making sure that kids are in an environment where that they have enough to eat, that they have good food, that their family is stable and not experiencing huge amounts of stress, is really important. And we know that access to high quality early education can be really great for kids too. So, but you know, still we're just kind of like throw our hands up for 0 to 5 and then go through K through 12. And yeah, the custodial part of school, right? The fact that somebody is just watching your kid is really important function of the education system. And so I think it follows that you would want that to happen for 0 to 5. And so the Joe Biden plan, which I just looked at, so I don't, I might get some of this slightly wrong, in which case I apologize in advance, but universal pre-K for 3 and 4-year-olds. So basically school now goes from pre-K 3 up through senior year in high school in terms of public education system. And then for 0 to 3, there's I think that it's based on Elizabeth Warren's plan, though I'm not entirely sure about that. Basically what they do is for low to middle income families, your expense for childcare gets capped at 7% of your income. And so that's what you pay. And then I think that there's some part of the plan to increase the number of childcare providers and improve them and whatever else. And so that 7% is really important because it means that if you're quite a low income family, that is the line that is the government determined as an affordability line. And so for low income families, childcare is often the single biggest line item that they face. And average childcare costs in big expensive cities are often higher than a full-time job at the minimum wage, and that's a really big problem. So making that so that's kind of scaled to how much you're earning is kind of a feature of it as well. So that's a huge change. This is like a really big, expensive investment in helping kids, and then also helping the parents, the grandparents, and the other parents, guardians who are watching them.
So I want to come back to this question about, you know, the Republican platform. You know, wherever you fall on the political spectrum, I think it is important to have some, I guess, balance or healthy tension between two ends of the, you know, the political right and left, where there is like vibrant ideas and philosophy happening on both sides, so that there is like healthy, I don't know if competition is the right, but marketplace of ideas, put it that way. We don't have that right now. No. And it's not only making it harder because the Republican or the right is sort of holding every good idea hostage, it's also eroding democracy. So I guess even if you fall on the left end of the political spectrum, there's something in it for you for there to be a healthy right. So what would a healthy right look like? Like, what are some, if there was like if the GOP went away and a new conservative, party or movement came in its place, what could it look like, and how would it address some of these questions?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. And to be kind of like neutral in terms of who has good ideas and party support and like whatever here, some really strange stuff has happened to the parties over, I mean, you could probably put it back to like the last 50 years, but like, let's just like look at the last 20 years, right? So in the 2000 election, there was concern that Bush and Gore were too similar, right? There was this idea that you could vote for either of them and they'd be like roughly the same.
I mean, some have made that argument about Trump and Hillary, so.
Yeah, seems like a tougher intellectual argument to make, but, and I think that was probably not true at the time, but it was true that so the parties had like a little bit more, they were both, the Republicans were closer to the center at the time. And so a bunch of not weird, stuff has happened. And I feel like when you think about the Overton window of policy, the Democratic Party has gotten bigger. So they now accommodate socialists, which there weren't so many socialists and they weren't so accommodative of those ideas. Even, Barack Obama could have been a moderate Republican in the 90s, but he was in the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party still accommodates these sort of centrist, neoliberal, right? Like, it's a really big tent now. And I think that also reflects the fact that the Democratic Party has just gotten really diverse, right?
But is that a function of the fact that there is no moderate right? And so that some of those folks who would be moderate Republicans just have nowhere to go except for, neoliberalism and the Democratic center?
Yeah. And I mean, what the polarization has been asymmetric, right? Republicans went to the right as Democrats also went to the left, but kind of kept their center. Republicans sort of lost their center a little bit. And I think that they became a party that was less about a sort of ideological orthodoxy of small government and government with a light touch and aggressive militarism and leadership around the world, right? Like, they're not about small government at all anymore, although they are about a small tax base. And Trump has shown way less interest in the kind of military and foreign policy of his predecessors, though I think you could kind of overstate that. But one strange thing, one thing that has happened, not to apply any words to it, but Democrats absorbed a lot of Republican policy. So cap and trade is a Reagan policy. Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush were really into market solutions for environmental problems. And then that became a thing that, like, you couldn't get Republicans to vote for that now. The Affordable Care Act was a Republican policy. Mitt Romney was really important in that policy creation. But Democrats, in order to try to appeal to the center, sort of, instead of going to a universal healthcare system, a single payer system or something like that, they went with the Republican proposal there. And so when you sort of look at what is left for Republicans, I think that there's a lot of ideological identity politics stuff. But I think that they've sort of turned away from having a really strong policy vision, a technocratic policy vision. There's a policy vision. Obviously, the Trump administration has done a lot on trade and a lot on immigration, and he really cares about those issues. But for really big parts of the federal government, they just haven't had anything. So I feel like the obvious example here is the ACA. They kept on saying, how many times did they vote to repeal it? Like 1 million times. And they never came up with anything to replace it with, so they never actually did that, despite promising it. And notably, Donald Trump promised that there was going to be universal health care, and then never did anything. And so I think that there's this question of, will the Republican Party moderate, as you point out? Will it sort of occupy that territory that it used to occupy? And I think that there's a lot of Republicans who want them to do that, want a return to compassionate conservatism, want a pro-family party that is appealing to the many, many, many people who vote Democratic but are church-going and are personally quite small c conservative. And they talk about this, and I think that maybe they just haven't gotten wiped out in an election badly enough to force them to actually do it, because we could have had this conversation at any point in the past 20 years with Republicans saying, like, we have to make gains among Black and Latinx voters. And then they don't, they don't. And they don't shift their policy regime.
It's funny you say that. I should say we're going to go to Q&A right now. So I'm going to ask Marion to come back in, and they're gonna, it looks like there's a bunch of questions. But before we do that, yeah, I mean, I think it's funny you say that, because I am reflecting on one of the debates in the Democratic primary, where there was this kind of, I thought, healthy exchange between, I don't remember if it was Bernie or Elizabeth Warren and Cory Booker, which I felt like could have been should be in a perfect world, a general election debate, with, you know, Cory Booker saying things like, you know, people in the communities where I come from want opportunity. They don't want to punish rich people necessarily. They want to know what your policy is to, like, help entrepreneurship flourish. And that is not, doesn't seem like really obviously he didn't do very well in the primary. And so I just wonder if there is a space for that kind of thing, and whether somebody on the right could pick it up. Okay, we're gonna go to Q&A. Marion, what's going on in that Q&A section?
Thanks for this conversation. It's been very, very fun to listen to and watch along. We have a question directly talking about this, political landscape. Why do you think Republicans were able to, as you say, lose their center and still maintain enough support to win elections?
Can I say something real quick? I think white supremacy is an easy answer, but I'll let the expert weigh in. Uh-oh, is Annie frozen?
Oh, yep, she looks a little frozen to me.
Okay, well then we'll let my white supremacy answer stand.
Perfect. I have a question that I can bat over to you, Catherine, if that would be helpful, while we're waiting for Annie to come back.
Yep.
Cool. How does tax reform figure in to the way out of the affordability crisis? Can you speak to Prop 15?
Yeah.
Schools and communities first.
Yeah.
And how about ways to fairly tax wealth to reduce our GI&I coefficient?
Yeah. So was that from somebody that we planted in the Q&A?
No, surprisingly.
Well, for those who don't know, Prop 15, which will be on the ballot in November, is a reform to the evil Prop 13, which passed about 42 years ago, and really created a deep structural inequity in California's property tax system, where that benefits entrenched landowners over newer landowners and homeowners and people who don't own land. Hi, Annie. Sorry, we're talking about property taxes, so I'm going to finish this answer and then we'll go back to you. Large corporate landowners also benefit from this tax, and that has starved the state of billions of dollars in funding for local services and public education, which largely would go to fill some of the gaps that Annie's been talking about in terms of the safety net. That would also kind of fix the structural problem in the economy, which allows basically large corporations to run a tax arbitrage scheme in California and make a lot of money on real estate without having to pay the associated taxes with the value that they're getting on those investments, and thereby starving, schools and local governments of the funds they need to invest in infrastructure and public services. So we're supporting that. That's, I think, to my mind, one of the most elegant solutions we could do to both raise the revenue that we need to fund the programs that we're talking about, but also fix structural inequities in the economy. And Annie, I don't know if you, this was a question about Prop 15, which is the corporate property tax reform on the ballot in California this fall. But there was also a question about other tax reforms that we could enact that would help kind of fix the structural issues in the economy that are causing wealth to get sucked to the top and for affordability to, or unaffordability to increase for middle and lower income families.
Yeah, absolutely. So the property tax issue in California is a big and a real one. Another one that I would point to is kind of just an eternal issue is closing loopholes that tax investment income more lightly than wage income, and in some cases make it such that investment income never gets taxed in some cases. I think that dealing with kind of offshoring issues would help with that. There's been like a real race to the bottom internationally in terms of tax. So there's really interesting proposals around that. There's a lot to do. There's also just a bunch of Swiss cheese in the code. So like getting rid of the home mortgage interest deduction, reforming the 529 plans, which are used by folks to save, almost exclusively by high income folks to save for their kids for college. There's a lot out there. And it's funny because the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act cut taxes a lot, but they didn't kind of get to the kind of kudzu in the tax code at all. But there's this like eternal cry. This was quite bipartisan, and they came pretty close to a deal on this during the Obama administration between Republicans and Democrats to broaden the base and lower the rates. And so that stuff, it's just, eternally, we could be having this conversation anytime in the last 30 years, and those answers would be the same.
And did you, when you froze, we were answering the question about why the Republican Party has been able to maintain so much control without, or power without holding on to their moderate flank. And my answer was white supremacy. And I didn't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I mean, one can overstate the degree to which Republicans are unpopular, right? Like they have 40% of the electorate, and just a lot of people will always vote Republican, and that's a matter of political identity, and the party appeals to them. So there's that. But as a general point, I think that voting restrictions and the difficulty people have voting has tended to benefit Republicans. And I think one thing that's sort of been interesting is the nationalization of the party and the degree to which, people just sort of vote up and down. So if they like their local Republicans, they're probably just going to vote for Donald Trump too, is at work here. And notably, kind of interestingly, Republicans at the state and local level have much more heterogeneity in the way in which they kind of exercise their power and their policy priorities. A lot of Republicans are actually quite moderate, though obviously you can point to a lot of state and local Republican representatives where that's not true. But yeah, so I just think the tiered system is kind of like a little bit at work there too.
Got it. Marian, back to you.
Great. So this one's for Annie. The great affordability crisis is clearly a multifaceted problem, like you've spoken about, including housing, healthcare, childcare, cost of living, student debt, and increasing income and wealth inequality. If you were advising a new administration, what would your first recommendation for the first policy initiative to tackle these intertwined issues be?
It's a great question. And it's really hard because I think all of these things need solutions. And there's kind of pieces, like there's really urgent pieces of this where I think you don't want to think about them just in an economic lens. So obviously healthcare is life or death issue, literal access to care, provision to care, how healthy and safe people are. We know that not having a universal system and having an unaffordable system leads to thousands of Americans a year dying. It makes it harder to address issues like the opioid crisis, which continues to be a really, really big problem. And so I try not to think about those, housing, I try to think of also not in totally economic terms, right? Like homelessness is an economic issue, but not a primarily economic issue. I also think it's like a human rights issue. And also it's just a kind of quality of life issue too, right? If you need to drive like 2 hours from the Central Valley to get to your job, like that's just really hard, and it affects everything else in your life. And so when I think about that, it's, I think about how important as a moral matter it is to think about healthcare in those terms. And if you had to pick one, right, it's both probably the biggest economic issue and I think the biggest moral issue. But it's really hard. I don't know what I would do. And I don't know that I don't know, it looks pretty likely, at least now, and I'm not a forecaster and I would never forecast, but if Democrats take the White House and if they expand their control of the House, it looks like they might get close to flipping the Senate. I don't know if they've said yet what the ordinal, like their first priority will be. I guess that the convention is in couple weeks, 3 weeks, I think it's mid-August. But I think that that'll be interesting to see. And actually, to our prior conversation, we don't really know what the Trump administration would do with a second term. Obviously, the pandemic is going to be that's going to be the emergency. But if you got one big bite at the apple at a big policy issue that isn't pandemic related, yeah, I don't know what that would be for this longer term stuff. Yeah.
Great. And then, given that the current administration will not address these issues, is a good comment, not my editorializing. What do you think companies should be doing to change these systemic issues? Should there be a Bill of Rights that companies adopt? Do workers need to push their companies? What role do they play?
It's hard. This is probably going to be a really unsatisfying answer, but I'm always like, we should let companies be companies. We should let companies be interested in making new stuff and making profits for their investors and shareholders and making money for the people who work for them. And we should deal with political problems through politics. And, that's kind of it's like, I feel that way about, there's always these questions of what should billionaires do with their $1 billion? And it's well, I don't know, we should solve social problems socially. But that said, I do think that it does seem like there are ways that companies can be good actors and can be focused on benefiting not just their high wage employees who they have to compete for really hard, but also their low wage employees. I think that's one thing. And I think it's been really interesting to see the internal conversations among tech companies kind of spilling out into the open about how are you a bad actor or a good actor in a world where we haven't answered a lot of these problems socially, despite the fact that a lot of people have wanted us to for some time. So sorry, that's kind of a non-answer, but that's how I think about it.
I kind of want to follow up on that, which is, I had this question on my list and we didn't get to it, but it does occur to me, and I don't know if this is a coincidence or not. I guess that's the question. Is this a coincidence or not? That the most recent tech boom kind of maps to the timeline of the affordability crisis that you outlined in your article. Is that a coincidence or not? Is there some role that tech companies or technology plays in this economy that we're living in?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to think about. Tech has reduced the price and increased consumer surplus in lots of interesting ways, but it hasn't managed to do it for healthcare. It hasn't managed to do it for higher ed, despite all of this stuff going online. It cannot, I think, categorically cannot do it for housing. I think it can't do it for childcare because robots are bad at taking care of babies. I do think that there has been a lot of interesting innovation that has come out of places like Code for America, just in terms of helping people access government benefits and sort of aiding in that way. Yeah, and I do think that when you look at tech in terms of where it is exemplifying some of these trends, right, the inequality, the wage inequality trends, the corporate concentration trends, where you have some tech giants that have gotten kind of uncomfortably big, and a Washington that has become much less interested in antitrust, so it seems that it's becoming more interested in antitrust. So that part of it, I think, is very real in terms of having companies that on the one hand are really lowering prices for things and are leading to really, I think the consumer surplus part of it is real, but are also eliminating middle class jobs and generating low wage jobs. That's a real issue.
So we're almost out of time. So I think we need to wrap it here, but I really want to thank you, Annie, for joining us. This has been a really interesting conversation. I highly encourage everybody to go on Annie's kind of author page on The Atlantic. There's a ton of articles about a lot of the topics that we've talked about. I encourage you to read. If you want to do something, if you're feeling like, oh God, it's hopeless and I want to turn this into something positive, we are working on that Prop 15 ballot initiative that I mentioned. And every Wednesday we hold a phone bank where from 5:30 to 8:30 where we're contacting voters. Yesterday, our volunteers contacted almost 3,000 voters. So if you want to help us with that, please sign up on the website. We'll also send an email to everybody, so you'll have the link right in the email. And if you work in tech, please consider becoming a member of TechEquity, TechEquityCollaborative.org. And we hope to see you all on our next webinar. It's August 6th, Marion. And we'll be talking about the disproportionate rate of homelessness among, or Black homelessness. So disproportionate rate of homelessness in the Black community. So we hope you will join us for that. So thanks everybody. Have a great rest of your week. Thanks, Annie. Bye.
Thank you.